Our chair for the final panel is distinguished scholar and professor from the School of Political Studies of the University of Ottawa, Claude Denis. He has acquired vast knowledge in the areas of federal and indigenous politics, human rights, and francophone minorities in Canada. So without further ado, Claude, I welcome Claude to the podium, and Claude will also introduce the next keynote speaker. Claude.
Thank you, Richard. Merci. D'abord, je veux remercier.
First, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this convention. It's a superb program, and I know that the afternoon will be highly interesting. So now I will introduce to you our next speaker.
Linguistic pluralism, and particularly Aboriginal languages in Canada, we must gain an understanding of the law and of how it relates to languages. Our next speaker, Ms. Naomi Metalik, is an associate lawyer at Birchells LLP in Halifax. She's originally from the Listugouche Mi'kmaq First Nation on the Gaspé coast of Quebec. She is an alumna of Dalhousie Law School and the University of Ottawa's Civil Law program, and she's currently working on LLM from Osgoode Hall at York University in Toronto. She's focusing for her LLM on, on administrative and constitutional law. She was the first Mi'kmaq person to clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada. She's a member of her firm's Aboriginal and litigation practice groups. Please join me in welcoming our very own University of Ottawa alumna, Naomi Metalik.
Merci. Gwe, Sidwen, Willigiskik, Nindaluizi, Naomi Metalik, Deleo with Listugouche Mi'kmaq First Nation, Inuizi Bazik Ichkaji, Me Bem Ginamasi. Ce que j'avais dit justement, c'est.
What I just said is I introduced myself, and I said that I can speak a bit of Mi'kmaq, not much, and I'm still learning it. So I want to thank the organizers.
I was speaking to some First Nations people from the area. Bonnie was helping me with this, so just to make sure that I've appropriately recognized the traditional territories of the Algonquin, the Iroquois, and also the Anishinaabe people today. Alors, ma présentation aujourd'hui.
So my presentation today, I will present to you the results. My results. I was clear with the Justice Bastarache at the Supreme Court of Canada, and you probably know it quite well. As a group working on languages, you know that he wrote books on language rights. He recently had the third edition of his book, Linguistic Rights in Canada. And in the third edition, it is only in French right now. But he had asked me if I would write a chapter on an overview of linguistic rights of Aboriginal people in Canada. So that's what I did. And I thought this chapter is really going to be short. But actually, it's 100 pages. And as you'll see today, there are still some gaps. There are some trials, but there are some gaps. So.
French and English. I'm a bit sometimes more comfortable in English, so I will operate in that language for most of the presentation, but happy to take questions in French as well. So just to give you a bit of an overview about languages in Canada. So the exact numbers are not specifically known, but well over 50, and they say between 53 and 70 different Aboriginal languages in Canada. Among that, there are 11 different language groups in Canada among the First Nations, and then there is the specific languages of the Métis, the Michif, which is usually a combination of the French language and the mother tongue, the Aboriginal language, the First Nations language. and then there is Inuktitut. And we have a speaker here from the territories, Nunavut, and they can speak probably better than I can on the subject, so I won't spend too much time on that. As far as breakdowns, you will see that the most spoken languages among the top three are Cree, Ojibwe or Anishinaabe, and Inuktitut. Between that, we have sort of the middle range, which includes Mi'kmaq, my mother tongue, or my community's tongue, Mohawk as well. And so you can see that there's certainly some groups in the middle, and there's also some groups that are quite, less than 50 speakers, including Tagish, some Abenaki languages, and various others. According to UNESCO, Aboriginal languages in Canada are among the most threatened in the world. Only Inuktitut, Cree, and Anishinaabe, Ojibwe are classified as flourishing languages. And I believe that both Cree and Anishinaabe, Ojibwe are in decline. This were statistics that I had taken, and they were the most recent that I could find. And unfortunately, they're from 1991, so they're no longer very recent at all. But they characterize that only 12% of Aboriginal languages in Canada are flourishing, 18% stable, many in decline, threatened, and endangered. And probably those numbers are even higher in the lower fields, in the decline and threatened area over the intervening years. Despite that, statistics show that, and a survey done of First Nations do show that at least 2 out of 3 First Nations people want to relearn their language despite the significant decline. It's fairly well known, I would think, among this group, but that they're, the very serious situation that Aboriginal languages find themselves in are a large part due to government policies at assimilation of Aboriginal people in Canada. Probably utmost among those would be the residential schools and also Indian day schools. There are other policies as well, of course, that should be mentioned. There's been since Confederation statutes that define who is and who is not an Indian, and for various parts of time people could lose their Indian status and thus their entitlement to live among their community and be among community language speakers. And so various women and their children and other groups of people lost their Indian status at various points in history in this country, and that too would play a part in loss of language. Those of you who do a lot of work with the Francophone community as well know all of the important things that language, the key things that it is related to, sense of identity, traditional knowledge, territories. I mean, it is what makes a people, really, to a large extent. And that's just highlights the importance of it. And I do a lot of work with First Nations. And, I hear it on a regular basis that is who we are, and that, the language, the knowledge about our laws, about who we are, it's all in the language. And without that, it is really hard to have that greater sense of identity. So it is extremely important, obviously. So I'm going to talk a little bit about different activities different efforts that have been made at various points in time to make Aboriginal languages more of a national issue. The Assembly of First Nations, l'Assemblée des Premières Nations, since about the 70s, has been making various attempts to make language a national issue. There's actually a timeline that I found when I was preparing this book chapter where the AFN actually has written several reports, has tried to make it a particular issue. Anyway, you can find it if you look for it online. And these days, the AFN actually has a specific working group that is specifically looking at education and language. At the time of the Charlottetown Accord, so currently, and I will talk a little bit about the Constitution, what protections are or and are not in it with respect to Aboriginal languages. And many of you will know that there's Section 35 of the Constitution Act that recognizes the Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal people of Canada. However, there is no specific recognition of self-government in that. There's been some recognition in the courts, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, perhaps. However, there's no specific recognition. At the time of the Charlottetown Accord, discussions were happening, there was an attempt to further define the self-government rights of First Nations people within those amendments to the Constitution. And one of them would have specifically recognized that First Nations have Aboriginal people have jurisdiction over language and education. However, as you all know, the Charlottetown Accord, the amendments, the referendum was a no vote, and so we never had those amendments. Did not succeed. Further, the Liberal government in about 2000 created a national task force on Aboriginal languages and had announced that it was going to put about $173 million into a fund and create an Aboriginal Languages and Cultures Center, which is sort of be a repository and a sort of think tank, and where many activities would happen in order to promote Aboriginal languages in Canada. There was also a report. A group of scholars were put together to actually create a report. It was called Towards a New Beginning, and the report was issued in 2005, and there are a number of recommendations in the report about what Canada and also provinces can be doing to further promote Aboriginal languages. Unfortunately, since it was authored, the report has largely gathered dust. Something that's not on my slide, but I will mention, is that in 2009, Senator Serge Royal did introduce into the Senate Bill 237, an act for the advancement of the Aboriginal languages of Canada and to recognize and respect Aboriginal language rights. Now, it was a Senate bill, so there was no money attached to it, and it didn't have the effect of recognizing Aboriginal languages as official languages, but what it did do was commit the government to taking steps to protect and promote Aboriginal languages. Unfortunately, it didn't make it past second reading. Okay, so that's a little overview of some of the initiatives that have been attempted. Moving on, I need to talk a little bit about some jurisdictional issues when we're talking about, well, who can do what if we're talking about promoting Aboriginal languages. So some of the lawyers in the room may know this, but language is not assigned to one jurisdiction or the other under our Constitution Act. It's viewed generally as being an area of double aspect, meaning both the feds and the provinces can pass laws with respect to languages. Now, there's some case law from the 90s where the Supreme Court of Canada said that Aboriginal and treaty rights go to the core of the federal jurisdiction. And so that there's this question that if language is an Aboriginal and treaty right, which is also a live question, is the promotion of Aboriginal languages something that is exclusively between the federal and the provincial governments, something exclusively within the federal jurisdiction of Canada? Now, we're going to look at that there's a few provinces that have specifically legislated over Aboriginal languages. So if my premise is the case, then that law is not valid. But there are some more recent cases from the Supreme Court of Canada that suggest that First Nations issues, Section 9124 of the Constitution Act, the jurisdiction over First Nations and other Aboriginal groups, is not a watertight compartment, and First Nations are not enclaves of the federal government, meaning that other governments can legislate. The province can legislate over some areas with respect to Aboriginal people. So there was a case from 2002 which involved a BC law that had to do with Aboriginal cultural artifacts, and it was challenged on the basis of being something that only the feds could do. But that's what the Supreme Court of Canada said in the case, that First Nations are not enclaves of the federal government, meaning that it was permissible for BC to have passed that legislation. More generally, the courts have sort of tipped their hand in a recent case about Aboriginal title that, the provinces can also pass laws that can affect Aboriginal and treaty rights, and that you look at it more from a lens of justification. I'm getting a little too legalistically here on this one, but anyway, the point is that in the large scheme of things, I don't think there's a massive problem with provinces legislating in this regard either. But let's get to another issue, which is Aboriginal governments. What jurisdiction do they have to take measures to protect their languages? So, most of you probably know that there's this really old act called the Indian Act that's been with us since about 1876, and it pertains to various matters respecting Indians as defined under the Act, which we today often refer to as First Nations people. The Act touches on many things, but it is absolutely silent with respect to language and also to education, or at least modern education. There were still a few, up until a year ago, provisions, a few of the remaining provisions that had to do with residential schools, but that didn't, for the most part, didn't apply in most communities. But largely, there's nothing on the jurisdiction of First Nations to pass laws with respect to languages and education in the Act. There was a case from BC. It didn't go to the Supreme Court of Canada, but interestingly, it said that Section 91 and 92, when it comes to the division of powers between the federal and provincial government, doesn't cover the whole ground of jurisdictional power, that there is room, because this case was about whether BC could sign a treaty with a group from, an Aboriginal group from BC that recognized an inherent jurisdiction of self-government. And one side tried to argue that all of the jurisdiction that exists is covered in 91 and 92, and there couldn't exist beyond that Aboriginal jurisdiction. And the court disagreed with that and said that there could be existing recognition of self-government. Also, in 1995, the federal government passed a policy recognizing the inherent right to self-government of Aboriginal people. And within this document, there is, in fact, a list of areas where the government recognized fell squarely within the jurisdiction of Aboriginal governments. And this includes language and culture and education. However, the policy, in fact, although it does recognize the inherent right, says that this right should be implemented through negotiations between First Nations and government. So that's why you have these treaty processes that are happening throughout Canada and various places where groups are trying to negotiate self-government and comprehensive claims. Today, those processes take an extremely long period of time. They can be negotiated for decades. At the moment, there's about a handful, I'd say maybe a dozen, maybe less, actually concluded agreements recognizing Aboriginal jurisdiction, and oftentimes there are land exchanges as well that are involved in these sort of modern day claims. Many of them, I think most of them, and we set them out, or at least they're footnoted in the chapter, do include a recognition of a jurisdiction of the groups that signed these agreements, that they have power to pass laws over education and culture and language. The issue, I mean, it's a very important issue, this issue of the jurisdictions of First Nations, but a point that really needs to be made. And there's some academics who argue that whether Canada recognizes these under a First Nations agreement, even if it's silent in the Indian Act, there's this inherent right that exists that is, supported by Section 35, and that First Nations should just go out and do it. So I think it's Kent McNeil. He said, just go out and do it, pass your own laws. And some First Nations have done things like, for example, the group that represents my community passed a declaration for the region that we live in, Qiskabewagi, on the Gaspé, and they said that Mi'kmaq is the official language of Qiskabewagi. So they've taken an important symbolic act in recognizing that, and those are, I think, important symbolic things to be done. And I don't think there are too many people who would rush to court to say that, no, the First Nation had no right to do that. However, even if First Nations can do those sorts of things, the real difficulty, or I think a real l'échec, or the real problem that still exists, is that in order to really take measures to support and promote Aboriginal languages, First Nations people, Aboriginal people need resources in order to do that. And even if they possess the inherent jurisdiction right now to say, yes, we're going to pass laws about language, they lack the resources to really be able to take the measures to properly safeguard their languages. Okay. So now I'm going to start to move into what are the some of the measures that have been taken in Canada in order to protect Aboriginal languages. So we'll start with the federal government. So I've already mentioned the Royal Commission task, the Task Force on Aboriginal Languages. Prior to that, in 1996, the Royal Commission report on Aboriginal peoples, as well as the AFN, have been constantly saying that Canada, the federal government, is certainly not doing enough to promote Aboriginal languages. As I said, there's nothing in the Indian Act. There's also nothing in the Official Languages Act or the Canadian Multiculturalism Act that specifically references Aboriginal languages. In addition to that, when it comes to education on reserves, it's generally Canada who funds education on reserves. There is no law, as I've referenced earlier, with respect to education on reserves, and Canada generally sort of regulates by way of policy. There is, however, be that as it may, there is some funding for immersion programs on reserves, but usually, and it was commented on in the 2005 task force report, that there's just simply not enough, that the money that is there for immersion programming by and large is in competition with funds for students with special disabilities and various other things, and there's just not enough to make it really a big priority. Canada, I believe, since perhaps 1997, has had a program called the Aboriginal Languages Initiative Program, which does specifically exist to fund certain programs for projects that First Nations would come up with in order to advance Aboriginal languages. However, the task force in 2005 found that it wasn't sufficient funds enough. I mean, I don't know the budget offhand, but it can result perhaps in a $5,000 grant for a project for this community or that community, but overall not found to be sufficient. The center that the Liberal government has sort of intended in 2002 was supposed to sort of replace the ALI initiative with something grander, but as I was saying earlier, it didn't come to fruition. Okay, so that's the federal. Let's move on to the provinces and territories. So that's a little bit more interesting, and we're going to hear some speakers on that today. So we see in the territories, obviously where there's a greater concentration of Aboriginal people, some of the stronger efforts to protect Aboriginal languages. We also, beyond that, see BC and Manitoba that have legislated to promote Aboriginal languages. I'll say a little bit more about that shortly. And then in most of the provinces, we find some policies promoting, primarily in the area of education in public schools, to teach Aboriginal languages or culture. In most provinces, I found some evidence that there's some policies that at least permit that. In some provinces, this is really the only thing that's going on. So that would be Saskatchewan, Alberta, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland, by and large. PEI, I did not find anything. It has 2 Mi'kmaq communities. It wasn't taking any initiatives to promote Aboriginal languages. So let's move on to some specifics. So the Yukon's Languages Act specifically recognizes the significance of Aboriginal languages in the Yukon, and the government wishes to take appropriate measures to preserve, develop, and enhance those languages in the Yukon. So there is that sort of general symbolic statement. How that's being implemented, I had more difficulty sort of finding exact examples of that. Now, in the Yukon, many of the First Nations there are in self-government agreements, and so they do have, and their agreements do have recognition of a right to legislate over language and culture. So that might be a response to some of this as well. The Yukon's Education Act requires the Minister of Education to include mandatory courses on the linguistic and cultural heritage and history of the Yukon's Aboriginal people. And on specific requests, I assume kind of along the lines of when numbers mandate or numbers are reasonable, the Minister can give permission to allow a course of study to be provided in whole or in part in an Aboriginal language. Moving on to Northwest Territories. The NWT's Official Languages Act recognizes 11 official languages, 9 of which are Aboriginal languages. And it does extend several protections, not to the same extent that French and English are in terms of publication of laws and such. However, there are some protections. So the OLA provides that government services at local and regional offices are to be in the official Aboriginal languages. It also creates an Official Languages Commission that has the right to enforce those language rights. And the Education Act of the NWT also provides that the language of instruction in schools must be in one of the official languages, and a school board can specifically decide whether there are numbers or is there significant enough demand to actually offer a program in an Aboriginal language. The most impressive, and we have a speaker from Nunavut, is the means that are being taken in Nunavut. So the Official Languages Act of 2008, this legislation comes from, establishes Inuit, French, and English as the official languages. There is also an Inuit Language Protection Act that specifically complements the Official Languages Act, which really sets down a number of ways in which Inuit fluency is to be promoted, both oral and written, and extensive rights are accorded thereunder. The government has also established a fund to finance projects related to those languages. So some of the rights, for example, that you can find within the Inuit Language Protection Act is a requirement that signs, les enseignes et panneaux publics, so public signs, need to be in Inuit languages. The provision, communication and provision of public services, and even services in the private sector by many organizations have to be provided in the Inuit language. Inuit is the official language of work in Nunavut, and no ill consequences can come to somebody speaking the Inuit language in their place of work. And some of the other rights that we see in the Yukon and NWT as well, about having the right to speak in Inuit language in the House of Assembly, and also that there's some requirement also as well that laws can be published in the Inuit language. However, it's not the same as the French or English language where laws necessarily have to be, but bills do have to be at least deposed in the House in the Inuit language. There's an Official Languages Commission, obviously created under the OLA and the Inuit Language Protection Act, and they have strong mechanisms to enforce language rights. So, like NWT, they are stronger even. There's also the Education Act in Nunavut that requires that every student receive a bilingual education, and that languages must be in Inuktitut and either French or English. So it's a required language of education. Moving on to some of the provinces, BC in 1996 adopted the First Peoples Heritage, Language and Culture Act, which serves to protect, revitalize, and enhance Aboriginal First Nations heritage, language, and culture. So what the Act does is create a fund through which those funds are to be used to promote projects, to promote language and culture. I didn't find a whole lot of evidence of how this was being implemented. Not to say that it isn't being implemented, but I don't have a lot of examples to provide. Something very interesting, and I will say something similarly occurred in Nova Scotia, is that BC signed an agreement with the federal government and First Nations in BC, which led to the passing of a First Nations Education Act, which gives jurisdiction over education on reserves to the First Nations. And that gives them much greater control over the content of the education and also the language of provision of education. So these are important steps that have been taken. In addition, Manitoba passed the Aboriginal Languages Recognition Act in 2010, which recognizes 7 Aboriginal languages as the Aboriginal languages spoken and used in Manitoba. They're not made official languages. However, there is some recognition that the government has an obligation to promote the preservation and use of those languages. Aside from that as well, Manitoba has, again, like other places, a policy on that. I'm getting the pink slip over here. I'm just going to say just a couple, maybe a couple more minutes, but well, I'm almost there. Quebec has a policy respecting Aboriginal languages. It hasn't really legislated. The only thing that really Quebec has done, there is some recognition in the James Bay Agreement that has specifically with respect to the Cree, there's some requirements for language provision services. Beyond that, though, I guess the greatest thing that Quebec did was exempt First Nations and the James Bay Cree and other groups from the provision of the French Charter of Languages. So on reserves, let's say, and within the treaty territory, the requirements of the French Language Act are not enforced. Nova Scotia, so like BC, they also have a Mi'kmaq Education Act, which gave jurisdiction to Mi'kmaq over the language and the content of education on reserves. And a little statistic, and I think one of our speakers may speak to it a bit more, about how I think successful these can be, is that 2 years ago there was a stat that the school board, it's called Mi'kmaq Ginatmaway, produced a stat that the graduation rate from its Mi'kmaq-run schools was 75%, which I think is higher than graduation rates from non-Aboriginal schools. So, and at these schools, these are particularly in the Cape Breton area of Nova Scotia, the students are getting a completely immersion Mi'kmaq education. It's quite something. I'm going to go just a little longer. Sorry. Just to say, well, I can sort of sum it up that the Charter does not include any specific protections of Aboriginal language rights. There's a non-derogation clause with respect to, the recognition of official languages, and also one that has to do with Aboriginal rights, that the provisions of the Charter shall not abrogate from Aboriginal rights. You could potentially make arguments based on the equality provisions of the Charter for some protections, at least if a government were to take measures that would impact negatively. If Section 15 was around at the time when residential schools were being legislated, maybe that would have been effective. However, today, I think the desire or the need of First Nations is more to have positive measures taken to enforce and promote languages. And it's doubtful that Section 15 can provide that. Well, at least at this point, it's not been interpreted very much to include the provision of positive rights. But, the Charter and the Constitution are living trees, so maybe the tree can get bigger. Aside from that, there are arguments as well under treaty provisions and also Section 35 of the Constitution that, and there has been no case yet, but that Aboriginal languages are clearly, most scholars recognize that this is an Aboriginal and treaty right. And that you could bring some sort of test case to recognize and actually require governments perhaps to do something. The question is, how far can it go? To what extent would the courts impose a positive right on governments to do something and to expend resources to do that? And what would be the sort of arguments back and forth? Anyway, like I say, there has not been a case yet on that, but I've heard rumblings that people are talking more about these issues, and there's more articles that are being written on that. My last point, and that feeds into this idea that perhaps a recours, a case is not too far in the future, not too far away in the future, that more people are starting to point to international documents, and in particular the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which has provisions that specifically recognize that it is a human right, an Indigenous right to revitalize languages and speak languages and to instruct children and other community members in one's language. And there are some, Canada did in fact endorse the UN Declaration. It's not ratified in a convention. It is a declaration, so it's not that type of treaty, but it has been endorsed by Canada. There has been some cases of recent date, none that have gone to the Supreme Court yet, however, that do recognize that Canadian law ought to be interpreted consistently with international norms. So there's some potential argument there that international norms like the UN Declaration provisions can infuse Charter arguments around Aboriginal rights. So these are all sort of arguments to be made in the future. And that has been my whirlwind of protections and gaps and other things as respect to Aboriginal languages in Canada. And I thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Nick. Does this work? Thank you, Naomi. So we do have a few minutes for questions before the next panel. So, sir.
Testing. Nyawatgoa for that. Gorohio Yuajats. So now we've heard Inuktitut and Mi'kmaq and a little bit of Mohawk. I'm Glenn Morrison, Aboriginal Policy Manager, Canadian Heritage. Pleasure to meet you. We must talk.
Yes.
Just a couple of points of clarification and information. The Aboriginal Languages Initiative was implemented in 1998, provides up to $5 million a year to support community-based language revitalization and preservation projects. It's highly competitive, the available funding being $5 million, and there being over 800 communities. And thanks to the works of researcher who's now an independent contractor, Mary Jane Norris, who's easily found by Googling that name. She's probably the preeminent researcher, analyst for Aboriginal languages data in Canada. Her research has turned up that there are still 90 Aboriginal languages spoken. That's not known because we have not been in a position to release the research. It is probably available directly from Mary Jane Norris. Okay. Census Canada tracks about 60, the remaining 30 being so small, and the available data and the accuracy of the data being falling into the level of data uncertainty, they tend not to track those. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for those clarifications.
Is this working now? Yeah? All right. Another question? Monsieur Fraser?
Graham Fraser, Commissioner of Official Languages. I wonder if you could describe what you see as the healthiest community in terms of language, of Aboriginal language use. You mentioned the special exemptions for the Cree in northern Quebec. You come from an Aboriginal community that has itself declared Mi'kmaq the official language. Do you have any sense of what the vitality is linguistically of those communities, or are there other communities that you could point to?
It really varies, Commissioner, and I don't have I haven't myself done sort of. There are many communities, as was referenced, between 600 and 800, and it really does vary. So I don't actually have a great grasp of that. I do live in Atlantic Canada, and I live in Nova Scotia. And what I find really interesting is that there's 13 Mi'kmaq communities in Nova Scotia, and the mainland has 7 communities, or reserved communities, and the language is almost not spoken there. However, if you go to Cape Breton, still part of Nova Scotia, most of the Aboriginal languages there, and I don't know if it's because they're more remote or what have you, but the language is incredible. The fluency is quite amazing. I go to some band council meetings and everyone speaks English, and then I can go to some band councils and everyone's speaking Mi'kmaq, and I'm trying to catch up and figure out what's going on. So it really does vary, and I think some of our panelists might be able to give even some better examples. I think Inuit would, and what's going on in Nunavut, I'd be very interested in to hear what language retention rates are like in that. But across the board, the view is that languages are in decline, obviously. But as far as the factors, I think it varies from place to place. One thing I will just sort of comment on is that technology does seem to be, and probably some of our speakers will speak to this, technology really does seem to be at least helping promote it among younger people. There's a young lady from New Brunswick that she has this hashtag, and she twitters and videos all the time, and it's just hashtag Speak Mi'kmaq. And she takes videos and she goes all over the place, and you see everywhere you go in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, you see youth wearing t-shirts that say hashtag Speak Mi'kmaq. And it's, at least, the kids are not becoming fluent through this, but they're actually actually promoting, and so there's sort of a grassroots effort to get more youth and kind of excited about speaking their language. So there's some neat stuff like that. That wasn't a complete answer, but there you are.
We'll have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Julia Debress from the University of Luxembourg. I work on minority languages, and I'm particularly interested in the topic of majority attitudes towards minority languages and how governments can try to influence those to create a more favourable environment for minority language use, both migrant and Indigenous minority languages. And what I was wondering in the Canadian case is, do you know of any research that's been done, or do you know yourself what kind of majority attitudes there are towards Aboriginal languages in Canada? And is there any kind of sort of common fellow feeling between Francophone minorities and maybe even Anglophone minorities with the kind of predicament and issues that face Aboriginal communities, or is that absolutely not the case?
To my knowledge, there hasn't been that much working together, but as there hasn't even been a case in Canada, as I was referring to, on Aboriginal languages. But I really do think, and I mean, that people, the Acadian and Francophone communities, and the cases that they've been able to bring, we should really draw on the knowledge and the some of the expertise that's been developed in that area. There hasn't been that many partnerships as yet, unfortunately, but I think there's a real opportunity for that as well. As to your other question, there's a debate in the task force report about whether sort of symbolic things like a government just doing something like what Manitoba did or BC did, just recognizing, although that doesn't, put money in programs to actually support it, but whether it, there's a debate about whether that achieves anything. But I think it does. There certainly is not, doesn't seem to be, and this is purely anecdotal. I couldn't find much research on this, but in terms of support for Aboriginal languages, promoting them, you don't hear much about that. It's not a huge subject of discussion in public discourse, unfortunately. But maybe our panelists might say more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah. So with that, we'll move directly to our next panel. I'll invite our four speakers to join me at the table here. And I will introduce them. Well, I suggest that we keep with the order that's in the program, just so as...
Different order in French and in English.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. That's interesting. I have a sort of working document here for chairs, I guess. And so we'll work from my document. Privilege of the chair, right? And so I'll tell you right away the order that I have. The first is Bonnie Jane Maracle, and I will do a fuller introduction of our speakers as they come up. So Bonnie Jane Maracle will speak first, followed by Marie-Odile Juncker, Rhonda Paulson, and finally Sandra Inutik. Bonnie Jean Maracle is of the Wolf clan of the Mohawk Nation at Tyendinaga territory. She holds a BA, bachelor's degree in Indigenous Studies at Trent University, or of Trent. She also holds a Bachelor of Education and a Master's of Education from Queen's University in Kingston, and is a PhD candidate in Indigenous Studies. She's back at Trent for that. She's a member of the board of Tsitionit Okwawena Language and Culture Center at Tyendinaga. She's also part of the Ontario Native Literacy Coalition in London, and a member of the board, sorry, this is oddly written, and language program coordinator at Kanatio Areke Mohawk Community in New York State. She's also a sessional instructor at the University of Victoria in the Certificate of Aboriginal Language Revitalization Program. Bonnie Jane is presently employed at First Nations House, University of Toronto, as the Aboriginal Learning Strategist.
Miawaze wa gwego, ye hodungo youngets, wagata uni, ganyonge haga, johaka gwajere. I'm glad to be here this afternoon. My real name is Yanto Dungwas. Oh, do I have to turn this on?
It should be on. Oh.
All of that's on my on my PowerPoint. Anyway, my real name is Yenho Dungwas. It means she opens the door. I'm from, and my English name, Bonnie Jane Merkel. I'm from the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation. I was born, raised, and reside in the Tyendinaga Territory. And I'm very glad to be here today, to be invited. I'm always glad to be able to share with people, I guess, my passion and my knowledge and experience in revitalization, language revitalization. So what I wanted to talk about today, of course, is the promoting and protecting Aboriginal languages in Canada. So as Kanien'kehá:ka people, Kanien'kehá:ka meaning Mohawk people, we're told and reminded often of our responsibilities in decisions we make, work we undertake, to the well-being of the future generations of our grandchildren, those faces yet to come. Promoting and learning promoting the learning and use of our Aboriginal languages is the centuries-old, tried and true method of protecting the language and its learning and use for the next generation. So that's how today we are still experiencing that methodology, which is, to the best of our ability, the most effective. Just press this. Next. So what I want to talk about in the next few minutes mostly is, again, keeping in with the promoting and protecting, talking about experiences from, I guess, my perspective, being on the panel of the people that have been invited. I'm probably the practitioner. Everything that I get talked about is from the grassroots level. My experience in programming, a language learner, trying to teach the language, or at least teaching what I know of the language. It comes from talking about my experiences here today. And the good practices, I'll touch on that, and also the challenges in promoting and protecting our original language. So first I want to talk about the experiences. So most of all, we are able to have a look at that whole thing about use it or lose it. Very, very true. That adage we know about, but for Aboriginal people and their languages, it becomes more of a prediction of what we've been able to experience. Okay. So looking at historical experience, we just were led through that whole idea of the federal legislation and the forced removal of our children for generations that affected the whole negative effect that has had on our language. So that has been a detrimental experience. Today's experience, however, is that we're able to realize the value that's contained in our languages, and that realization is becoming stronger and stronger, has become stronger in the last, say, grown in the last 40, 50 years, as today that realization is very strong, and the young people are looking for programming to relearn their languages. Most of all, spiritually speaking, we've learned also too, and we've heard everybody, Indigenous people are told that our languages are a gift from the Creator. Our languages are gifts to the human beings in their diversity of when we were created. Just as all the birds had all their voices, all the colors and nations of people had their given voices. So, what is our experience? We've experienced life without our language for generations, but today we have opportunity to experience life in our languages, instilling in our people, and especially our babies, an identity and a sense of purpose. So I want to have a look at some good practices. Language revitalization movement. It's a movement now in the last maybe 10, 15 years that has gathered momentum over the last 10, 15 years. It has become a definite benefit to the new generation of Aboriginal people in this country. The goal of language revitalization is simply to reestablish our original languages as living languages and languages of communication amongst us. Existing programs, my experience has been in language is now experienced in the homes, in our schools, in communities, for all age levels and across all domains. The programming consists of Language Nest, Master Apprentice programs, elementary, secondary, and adult immersion programming, summer language camps, weekend language camps. We have day classes, night classes, and core subjects in our high schools and in our elementary schools. So today we have online language classes and language apps. So everything is being adapted to suit whatever is a good practice for that community. Technology has become to play a very important role in the development of language learning, in that they have been able to develop language tools to support language learning. So some of the challenges, all this growth and expansion and movement in light of everything, the challenges that we have faced over through the historical trauma is met with challenges. But thinking over this, there are kind of like three main areas of challenges that the Indigenous language revitalization efforts have faced. One of them being, of course, the education system itself. One of the things that come to mind is that the accreditation of original language study, especially in high schools, is not recognized. You can take it as an option. However, it's not, if you take French, you get a credit. So those things, it's a struggle to work with school boards on trying to get them to see that. And in many, many areas yet, there are no hiring of the unqualified fluent speakers. So even though they were born and raised in the language, mother tongue speakers, they still can't work in the schools because they don't have teaching credentials. However, they are our professors. So getting that through to the system becomes a barrier. Political support, we've touched on that idea of political support is very, very valuable. My hat's off to the gentleman from India of how, from the top down, a system has been developed for those millions of people that syncs to the communities and to those tribal languages for total support. So what we have here is missing at local, provincial, federal level support. And of course, we always in our programming at the grassroots level have a lack of adequate financial support for any programming that we're doing. And one of the other challenges in our communities is actually working with our own people. Because of the residential school syndrome now, and that legacy that comes out of residential schooling, our fluent speakers have a fear and shame of even speaking their language and helping out with programming that's going on. Also, two other people, because of those same reasons, have an attitude of why bother? You know, where's that going to take us in today's society? So our own people have a lack of awareness of the language value that comes with our original languages. So language promotion and protection, because original languages are part of creation, the natural world. Original languages are a sustainable resource. We just have to use them to promote and protect them. So our adage is, our saying is, I guess what keeps us going is that no matter what you know, use it. Use the little bit you know, whether it's one or two words or phrases or something, use what you know wherever, whenever, and with whomever you talk to. We do not have to apologize for the use of our original languages that are the gifts from the Creator. So that's looking at those three aspects of experiences and good practices and challenges. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I think we will have time for questions and discussion at the end, but we'll go through our four presentations first. So our next speaker is Dr. Marie-Odile Juncker, who's a professor of linguistics at Carleton University. She describes herself not only as a linguist, but as a lover of linguistic diversity. She works on Aboriginal language documentation and maintenance. She uses a participatory action research framework to work with communities and individuals interested in saving their language and seeing it thrive in the 21st century. Dr. Juncker also created the Algonquian Linguistic Atlas that I'm sure she'll be telling us about, which is evolving in a large collaborative project to build a digital infrastructure for Algonquian dictionaries and other resources. She regularly facilitates language documentation workshops at Carleton or in the communities she works with. Her current projects include a dictionary of the Atikamekw language spoken in Quebec and a digital infrastructure for Algonquian languages. Marie-Odile?
Oui. Wajie, Marie-Odile Ni, Ottawa-Chnouchi, Carleton University. Je viens de me présenter en...
I just introduced myself in the Cree language from the East, the first language on which I worked, and I studied as a second language. Mr. Technician, I don't think we will have time for the images. I think it doesn't work, so we could keep it at the end. You could start my presentation now, please.
Donc,
I will talk to you about the research that I did during the last 15 years about how the information technology and communication can revitalize the Aboriginal languages. One of the issues or questions that I asked myself was how to help those languages. I started in year 2000 with this question. I used a theoretical framework from participation research. In this type of framework, the research process is as important as the objective. And I work mostly with partners that are involved in the teaching of languages or the development of curriculum for languages. I started with the teachers of the Cree school board in Bay James. Just like my colleague said, they have their own school board. And then I worked with the Innu in Quebec and in Labrador. The Inuits are very interesting because the Quebec Innus, we used to call them the Montagnais. They're not so the Innu are from Quebec. They speak Innu and French, and the Innu in Labrador speak Innu and English. So they have the Innu language as common. But since the jurisdiction is provincial, there's no sharing of the resources. So in the Innu dictionary and the other resources, we try to create resources that would allow us to share beyond the provincial boundaries. Is there interpretation for people who listen to English? Furthermore, with this process, we are open to the comments from the population when we look at the teaching as an emerging tendency. So I specialize in Cree and Innu languages. You said that there was 80% of stability in those languages, but the dialects are not necessarily understood by everybody. So we have very varied languages. But you mean things are not forward? Oh, I had to do it. It doesn't work? I'm sorry. Oh, I was moving it forward on my computer. So here we have very varied dialects, not understood by everyone. So there is a lot of work that has to do with offering resources, workshops to see what people need, to define the objectives of the research, and to meet the needs of different objectives. And here's the team with that's part of the Cree dictionary. We worked a lot with the grants from the Cree school boards and federal grants and so on. We also created a lot of tools, but I will mostly talk about the online dictionaries. The East Cree Dictionary, we started at the end of the 1990s, and we put it online since 2005. Thank you. And Innu since 2013, Cree, Moose and Swampy Cree since 2014. Naskapi has a very different story. I'll talk to you about it at the end. There's another project that was created with this Participation Research Project, is the Algonquin Atlas, which was a second language tool for people who are working in communities. So I created CDs, and I was using Cree students in my research lab during the summertime, and we did the Cree verb. It's not like sing-sang-song, it's not like the Breshrill. So there's 784 forms to conjugate a verb. So I thought that, those poor young people, they'll never see the end of the project. It's true. 15 years later, I'm still working on it. That's an invisible work. It became, we did a CD of conversation and became very popular. The other communities asked me to adapt it for their own language, and now it is that linguistic atlas that allows us to have excuses to share resources with some files that you can download. That's an example. In 2015, that linguistic atlas has 43 dialects and more, 47,000 files are you can download. It's really interesting. We make trees and so on. So we have 3 conversation trees. It's very popular. I'm just giving you a bit of an anecdote. There was a young Cree man who was in a hockey school, and he really speaks Cree. It's his mother tongue. He downloaded the Cree app, and he told his mom, I'm listening to Cree from my community in the evening, and it really, when I'm homesick, I listen to it. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we skipped that. So he was listening that on his phone when he was homesick. So when we do resources for Aboriginal populations, whatever, it will be used in 50,000 other ways that you wouldn't have thought about. And I also would like to mention many things. We did History Online thanks to the funding from Heritage Canada. Here is an example from this approach. These are ideas that came about while discussing this with the partners, and it came about from the creation. It's nice to give oral history. I started in 2002 to give workshops of a sound edition to young Aboriginal people and from people who work at the radio. And anthropologists gave me their old material. We have more than 550 downloadable stories that are classified. We even have videos we did for the Cree, for the Innu. These are classified by using different categories. I don't know if you can read it at the left side. These are, it's not imposed by Microsoft or Google. These are categories that we developed ourselves with the professors in school to see what is useful, and these are categories that are linked to the traditional conceptualization of the cultures. So we could listen to stories. They're not transcripted, they're oral, they're only described in Cree, Innu, and English and in French. There's a little summary, but the stories are made to promote the oral culture. So there's children who spent a lot of time in the cars between Bay James and the south. They can listen to other things than Disney, and that works really well. There is another point that I discovered after 15 years of working in this field is we need to take care of the users. It's really nice to do an app and a website and to do lessons online. You have to go and see what's happening in the communities. Today, people from Labradors cannot download our apps because they have no internet. They cannot go to online. So they download the app of their dictionaries in another city. So what I did during my grants, I gave it a little bit of money to send my technical director, here he is, to visit schools to see how things are happening. And sometimes it's just about putting a flash player, and the technicians that were trained are not trained to put the syllabus on the computers. So they can use the resources. So I wanted to mention it because it's a point that is very important. And it's not, really high tech. This is an example of an Innu dictionary. We encourage contacts with the users so they could contact the editorial team. These are the dictionaries of the East Cree. These are live dictionaries. We have an editing committee that is active every year, and they do revisions of and update the dictionaries. It's very important for an online dictionary and also for the development of new terminology. We worked a lot in the medical terminology, and we put that on terminological files and so on. Here is an example. When we launched the Cree Dictionary in 2006 on the web, we did not think that it would be so popular. French did not exist. It was only in English and in Cree. We had 73%. We had about 11,000 words that were researched and looked at that year. It's the first year that it was in line. In 2012, we reached 52 to 55,000 words researched for a language that has 10,000 participants. It's more than 1,000 words a week. Don't tell me that people don't need to speak the language. And if you look here, the Cree language, the syllabics is a net increase, so people are looking for the words in their own language. If we give them the tools, they can look at it in the syllabics. We also developed the research tools to allow alternative ways of writing, so people could write the word according to the sound, and the research tools are adapted and will find the word to help them. Here, in 2013, the Innu dictionary, we had more than 55,000 words that were looked up. In red, the French is very popular. Innu is majority, very little English because internet is not very good in Labrador. I'm expecting that when internet will be better in Labrador, it'll be different. And then we launched the app of the dictionary for our Labrador population because they could put it there. And then we noticed that people in Quebec, they had the iPads. They were putting their dictionaries on the iPad as a second screen, and they were working with the computer. So we have a little decrease, but still 50,000 words research for 2014. That means that it's still very well researched. So here we're talking about 8,000 people who are looking for it. So how do you expect the success? So I'm doing more and more. 1,800 downloads for the Innu dictionary since 2013. If we have Facebook pages, we have more than 2,000 people who are following our Facebook page. It's maintained by my partner. Everything is in Innu. They announce their cultural activities and they answer questions in Innu. We tried the blogs, and what's interesting, I don't know if you can see it, the gray is the usual users from Facebook. It's the population that is between 16, they're between 18 and 24 years of age. But in the superior part, you can notice that for us, the largest users are women between 25 and 44 that follows the activities linked to the Innu language. So those are mothers that convey the language to their children. And you will see the origin of our users, Sept-Îles, Mingan, Natashquan, all those places are the Innu communities that we are serving with that work. And during the last 4 years, I did the promotion of the integrated tools. Firstly, there are not many people who could work on that. The Aboriginal and the Aboriginals have very limited resources. Often they're language specialists, the cultural specialists, people who do the public presentations, and the administrators, and the ones who have to do the reports for Heritage Canada. Oh, we hate you for your reports at Heritage every month, so we can't do the work because we always have to make reports. I'm sorry, I'm telling you this. And we receive the money in November, and we have to have finished by the 31st of March. Well, why integrated tools? Because once we have a model, we can go from one to the other. There is a familiarity for the larger population. We want easy access for those who bring the content, our Aboriginal partners, as well as the technicians. Systematically, we offer training to technicians in the Aboriginal community so that they could help us, because I just couldn't make it. I couldn't meet all the I couldn't answer all the demands. We promote the consistency of content across tools. It's, you know, we don't need to have grammar from one person and a dictionary from another, and they both don't use the same way of writing. They don't function the same way. It doesn't help the Aboriginal languages. And by working with open sources, we have access to technical help, because I have one technical director for all of my projects, but they work with open source communities, so that's a wonderful possibility. But I would like to end with this. This is something that's really close to my heart. So with the integrated tools, and now that we have 12 dictionaries together in the across Canada in a big linguistics family, we're exploring the possibility of maintaining those tools on a long-term basis, because Aboriginal communities, you know, it depends on who is the chief and so on. It's very volatile. The grants come and go. There is no guarantee that there will be money next year and so on. So we are trying to find all the Aboriginal partners say that we have to find solutions either at a federal level, and very happy that I was invited, because I will speak here. In 2012, the Tshakapesh Institute, my partner in 2010, Gabrielle Huard, contacted them, who was the director of Termium, who was exploring the possibility of supporting Aboriginal dictionaries. So we, on the 11th of June 2012, I wrote to the Bureau de the Translation Bureau, and I asked to have someone at Termium who could find a long-term solution of Cree Innu and Aboriginal language that we developed. So the Innu and Cree dictionary, I could show them that there was 50,000 words downloaded per year. It took me 2 years to find the right person at the Translation Bureau. In the meantime, I had to teach, and then on the 24th of September 2014, I received this message to follow up on our conversation. I confirmed that we checked the possibility of giving you a structural funding, but it's not in the mandate of the Translation Bureau, and we don't have the funds to meet your needs, short-term or long-term. So thank you for your interest. And to worsen things, in November 2014, the Naskapi dictionary that we put online in 2002, thanks to the help of Archives and National Library, is sent the message to the nation. They could no longer keep that dictionary. The interface was not great. but at least it was something. They could not leave that dictionary online. We are
database. Et alors là, j'en reviens pas.
I couldn't believe it.
Alors ceux qui connaissent.
So for those of you who know Unicode, Unicode is the standard. We fought for years. We put everything in Unicode. We convinced Aboriginals that we had to use Unicode. We did conversions. We're still doing old texts in Unicode. And there we were told, I think that the person that we asked to answer, we asked this person to send the message. That person does not know the real problems. So that's my position now. Thank goodness I received a project from the CRSH for 5 years. It is part of the linguistic class, which is the Algonquin Dictionary project. We are harmonizing it. We're looking for solutions. And now we're really mercenaries. Which one is the cheapest of the service in 5 years? If it doesn't work, let's go and see Google. We will have to do publicity or ads. I don't know. These days, the Association of Ontario Libraries offered to take me as a guinea pig, as a project, as an experimental project for archiving and maintaining this on a long-term basis. We have all those dictionaries that are online, and we are putting them online. We're working with them. Most of them are live dictionaries. So I'm asking the members of this room, if you have ideas to help us, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Marie-Odile.
Thank you very much, Marie-Odile. So now we will ask our third speaker, Dr. Rhonda Paulson, who is from Terrace in British Columbia. And then her family moved to Hawaii to come back to Ontario later. We're wondering, why leave Hawaii to come back to Ontario? Especially after the winter we had.
From the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, specializing in adult education, community development, and counseling psychology. Her master's degree is in Canadian Heritage and Development Studies, also from Trent University, which is popular around here, it seems. She's been a faculty member at Trent since 2000, as well as serving on the committee to develop Canada's first PhD program in Indigenous Studies, also at Trent.
Sorry. It takes a hold of you. It really does.
Recently, Rhonda published her first book, Spirit of the Island, Manitoulin's People, which is completely translated into Ojibwe by Elder Shirley Williams and is required reading at Trent and at Nipissing Parry Sound District secondary schools. Currently, in addition to teaching in the Indigenous Studies Department at Trent, she is project manager in the School of Education and Professional Learning for designing and developing a new 5-year concurrent Bachelor of Indigenous Education program to start in September 2016. Rhonda?
Thank you. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this conference. And to everyone here. I was here yesterday, and so I revamped my talk today based on some of the comments that I heard and just the atmosphere in the room. There were so many backgrounds, yet with so many shared experiences that reach into the depths of who we are. And what stands out is the respect that is afforded to each other and ourselves when such diversity is represented here all in one room. It was very encouraging. So I think if this could happen in broader society, just think of the milestones that we could reach if we just carry this, this mood and this connection that we've made here today outside of this room with us. Also, to listen to those who melodically transition back and forth between French and English, it just amazes me. So as far as I'm concerned, you are role models and inspirational for language speaking. And at some point I was very disappointed in myself because I have lost French. I lived in Ottawa back in the 70s, and when I lived here I could speak it, read it, write it, because I was here. And as someone mentioned yesterday in their speaking, it's true. When you move away from being associated with the language, you tend to lose it, especially if it's your second language. So my apologies to my colleagues who speak when I don't have the earphones on and I can't understand you or respond to comments that you've made. So, but I knew you were introducing me, so we're good. So also in that regard, thank you very much to those who have taken their time to do the translations for us in the back room there. So my background, as my introduction has said, is that I was born and raised in northern British Columbia, Terrace, BC, which is directly center of what has become known as the Highway of Tears, which is another issue, a major issue for Indigenous people of Canada, but one that stands unfortunately outside of this presentation. However, suffice it to say it was an integral part of my growing up there as a young girl. And this will just be the start of giving you the background to why I do the work I do today. So this is very much in a different slant on a personal level. For my identity, besides being Rhonda Paulson, I could be called a microcosm of multicultural society. My Indigenous heritage is Plains Cree from southern Saskatchewan, which is on my dad's side, who is also part Danish and German. From my mom's side brings mainly Irish with some South African. Then what I had was called a mixed marriage. I use quotes around that term. So with my children, I now have added Hakka and Laotian. And so I scoff at the terminology of mix because I've only heard that used when your skin color is different. So it really means nothing. And people who are in that situation actually don't really appreciate being identified as from the color of our skin. But then, having lived in such diverse cultures, ranging from northern BC to Hawaii, which was in the 60s during Vietnam and the protests and the uprising and everything that was happening there, then back to Ottawa, then northern Ontario, and then back to rural southern Ontario. So I have lived as a majority and a minority, as being visible, and unfortunately as being invisible. So my life experience has definitely formed my belief system that defensive boundaries, because from a psychologist's point of view, we need healthy boundaries, but that's very different than defensive boundaries, which was raised in discussions yesterday around rights and also brought up again today. But I find that those boundaries over who we are and our struggles for self-identity sometimes become our own obstacles. Without anyone else putting the barriers there for us, we have learned to do it ourselves. I will address two of my own efforts in dismantling barriers in the closing part of the presentation. So as a very brief explanation, I'm just going to have to speed this up a bit, so sorry for the translators. But a very brief explanation of indigeneity in Canada, and this comes out of comments and questions that I heard yesterday, is that first the terms Aboriginal, Native, or even First Nation do not really fairly represent the hundreds of Indigenous nations in Canada, living for thousands of years in this land from coast to coast to coast, emphasizing that it was not an empty space. To think otherwise would be equivalent, say, to merging German and French identities as having the same culture, language, background, spirituality, worldview, et cetera, because of their proximity. So each Indigenous nation is in what is now Canada has a distinct culture, social order, political structure, and language. So to represent all languages in one school system is impossible. But at the same time, that does not mean that equal chosen language cultural representation is impossible, which I will also explain at the end too. So this is going to have to be really fast. Just to give a bit of the background, and I'm going to edit as I go. Going back to the politicians, let's see, with the Department of Indian Affairs, devised a political framework in the latter part of the 1800s, when policies were written to ban all Indigenous languages in Canada from being spoken or written. Most notable in this regard is the policy written by Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent General with the Department of Indian Affairs in 1909. The happiest future for the Indian race is absorption into the general population, and this is the object of the policy of our government. the great forces of intermarriage and education will finally overcome the lingering traces of Native custom and tradition. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada who has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question. I don't think anyone would like to be addressed as a problem or a question, to be erased. The residential school system was the principal site for Scott's political agenda, with language being one of the most significant foci. As one elder recounts, some people say they wanted to assimilate us. They wanted us to learn the English language, but we had the French language and the Latin. We just didn't have Ojibwe. Other elders remember, one of the things I learned pretty quickly was that we were told not to speak the language. You didn't want to get caught. And I won't elaborate on what happened when people did get caught, because I think with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, those stories have now become public. I know with my children, I didn't speak to them in our language because I was afraid that they would have the same problem that I had when I went to school. And another, I know for myself, since we weren't allowed to speak our language, you could say that I was dumb for years. Since we weren't allowed to speak our language, it was before I learned the English language. I only knew the native language, the Anishinaabe language, before I went to school, but we couldn't speak ours, so I was dumb. Another elder had a different experience. I kept my language. I still speak it. I think it's starting to come back now that there are stories in the native language and that they have that in the schools. The language is very important to us. They say that if you lost that, you lost everything. I still have my language. Indigenous language courses are becoming more and more prevalent in the school system today, but continuing the emphasis on immersion is needed. As one secondary school student recently experienced, we had language in the school when I was growing up. It was part of it like math and reading. That's where we learned the words. We didn't learn it conversationally. My parents are Ojibwe and I can understand what they say to me, but I can't always answer back. I just can't do it. I can answer them in French because I took French all the way through high school, but not Ojibwe. I feel there can be a loss of culture over time, and once it's gone, it's gone. And I know that's a sad statement to end with, but at the same time, end that paragraph with, don't get your hopes up. Okay. But what I like about what she says there is just the simultaneous understanding of cultural language. Once the language gone, the culture is gone. And this is what I think we have to keep at the forefront. When we teach language, we are teaching culture. And when we are living culture, we are living language. So in the end, it remains that language connects people to their history, culture, and identity. Therefore, it is imperative to revitalize Indigenous languages that have been previously banned by laws of our own government. Let's see. The role of language in the school is a prominent concern for Indigenous educators in order to ensure that Indigenous students are equally represented in the curriculum, the written word, in the instruction, the spoken word, and in attitudes, the implicit word. Doing so can preserve the integrity of the language as well as the cultural and identity affiliation that comes from the language. We can then look forward to teaching future generations the same. Which leads me to the two examples I mentioned earlier of what I'm doing as a contribution towards these goals, and not to point to my role specifically, but as an idea for people when you're thinking, well, what can I do as one person? Because like Bonnie was suggesting though too, is just do whatever you can, one step at a time, and whatever efforts you can make. So instead of following my notes, I'll just speak to these two issues. It'll be much easier. So the first thing is, as a professor of Indigenous Studies at Trent University, over the years, I've been there since about 2000, my second career, frustration and aggravation and sadness over the students coming in, no matter what age. We have mature students and students directly from high school, with little to knowledge that they would have is not being actually correct to Canada's true history. So over the years, you get tired of waiting. So I just finally decided that's it. And I talked to my chair and said, I'm just going to write my own book and gear it towards secondary school. And let's try to get the information in there. Let's take it one step further. Years ago, my dear colleague and friend, Elder Shirley Williams, asked me to do the illustrations for her dictionaries in Ojibwe. So we met years ago. So then I thought, well, we got along just famously. I asked her the huge question, would you translate the entire text into Ojibwe for me? And she agreed. So her and her nephew, Isidore Toulouse, did so. And so this is the book that resulted. And I brought it because there are many people here who I'm thinking probably have not seen Anishinaabe-Moan written. And so it's completely translated, so it's both in English and then in Ojibwe, and covers topics of politics, Indian Act treaties, residential school system, 60 Scoop, missing Aboriginal women, all those issues, and then in both languages, so it can be used as a language text. And it's being directed towards secondary schools, as I've mentioned. It's just been published. I just finished it just last year. So it's getting into the school system, which is wonderful because it's just so much exposure then. And the feedback has been very positive. So that's encouraging. So the second item, try to hold down because it's so exciting, brand new, is the new program that was mentioned, starting at Trent University. And it's a new Bachelor of Education program. What makes it new is it's a 5-year integrated program specifically for Indigenous students and it's in Indigenous education. So it is training Indigenous students to be teachers, not just of Indigenous education though, teaching in rural schools, First Nations, urban, anywhere. They will be qualified by the Ontario College of Teachers. I only stepped into this role 5 weeks ago, but just to emphasize my passion and conviction towards language, and not without a lot of hurdles, but still with some major supports. What's already been approved is to have a teachable in Ojibwe, which means that the teachers will teacher candidates will graduate to be able to teach Ojibwe language in secondary schools as well as elementary schools, and not just as language courses separate from the curriculum, but immersion, so that we will have math, science, geography, social studies, etc. being taught in Ojibwe. And this will be the first program of its kind in Canada. So we're gearing up, believe it or not, to open in September of 16. So we'll see how that goes. But this is the finish. So thank you very much for your time and your attention. And I hope I've given you some ideas of maybe some things that you can do as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Rhonda. Our fourth speaker is Sandra Inutik, who's the Languages Commissioner for Nunavut. Sandra graduated from Akitsirak Law School, which is a legal education program, was and is in Nunavut. So she graduated in 2005. Before attending law school, Sandra worked for 7 years in justice and policy evaluation. She's committed to language rights and finds her previous work, including advocating for youth and other organizations, useful for her current role. Sandra?
Thank you for having me here. I was going to start in French just to reciprocate Stefan's gesture, but I got nervous. I'd like to acknowledge my colleague, Francine Linton. She's here with me from our office. I'll give you a very brief overview of the population, what Nunavut is about. Nunavut, the land mass is 1/5 of Canada, and it's in the northeast. So very large geographical area with 36,700 people dispersed. And our largest town is just our capital city, 7,000, just over 7,000 people. Inuit make up 83% of the population in Nunavut, and 71% of the population speaks the Inuit language. You'll hear the terms Inuktitut being used, Inuktitut, Inuit language. During the process of creating the language acts, the people in the most western regions of Nunavut said, we don't speak Inuktitut. They have a very different dialect. They speak Inuit Naktun. So we've started using Inuktitut to cover both Inuktitut and Inuit Naktun. So you'll hear me saying either Inuktitut or Inuit language. So on the question of Section 35, I was very happy that Ms. Metallic gave an overview. Whether Section 35 says existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. This is very broad and doesn't provide any closed list of what Aboriginal rights are in Canada. So Section 35 leaves you with two big questions in Canada that we grapple with. One is, do these Aboriginal rights include language rights? And the other one is right to self-government. And for us in Nunavut, these two questions are very related, and I'll explain that. So with these questions, as Canadians, we have two options, or as world citizens, because we have people from all over the world here. So the broadness means there's, what could mean, one, that there is no right. We continue going as we do today, just pretending that these rights don't exist in Canada, and continuing on the damaging consequences with this idea, because it maintains the assimilationist policies that exist if we don't recognize that these rights exist. So the second option is that there is a right, or at least a potential for it. So these options really reflect our relationship as Canadians between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people, and our need to reconcile as a people, as Canadians, and that there's issues still lingering which translate into policy or non-policy and funding. And I wanted to also, as part of this relationship, there's often this dynamic that I was speaking to Francois last night after his introduction to the reception last night, and he was very nervous about talking about Aboriginal people. So we have this kind of uneasiness to talk to each other, to talk about each other, and for Aboriginal people wanting, for us, some say in how law relating to us is interpreted, and Section 35 is one of those, and not wanting to appear as an agitator, provocateur, because unfortunately as minority groups, when we speak up, that's how we appear, because speaking up against the status quo, you appear as an agitator or a provocateur. So I want to take you on my magic mystery tour bus of why Section 35 includes language rights, so that you can see the basket is full rather than empty. In our language acts, as it was explained, we have two language acts. The Official Languages Act, which recognizes English, French, and the Inuit language as the official languages, and obligates the public sector to provide services in those official languages. And in the preamble, in OLA, which went through the federal parliament because it needed concurrence. So it got approved in order to apply in Nunavut. One of the interesting statements in the preamble is determined to advocate for and achieve the national recognition and constitutional entrenchment of the Inuit language as a founding and official language of Canada within Nunavut. So the language is advocate for and achieve. In the Inuit Language Protection Act, which is an act trying to ameliorate the Inuit language, to revitalize and protect it, the language is a bit stronger in terms of Section 35, and I'll read it to you. Understanding, because of the fundamental character of the values expressed and the important objectives of this act, and on legal authority, including Section 15, 25 to 27, and Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, that the Inuit Language Protection Act shall enjoy quasi-constitutional status in law. And this went through just the Nunavut Legislative Assembly. It didn't have to go through the Parliament here. So it's interesting, just the difference between the two acts, the preamble, which set up the context of how the acts are to be interpreted. So I'm going to give a little bit of a historical overview of why language and self-government are so interconnected, or one in the same in Nunavut, and why it's important in terms of Section 35, as Ms. Metallic explained. We've just done it in Nunavut. And we've applied Section 35, and 10 minutes, okay. So it's, but it took a long time to get there. In the late 1960s, a lot of minority groups, as a response, probably as a consequence of the civil rights movement in the U.S., started to organize and speak up, including the French in Canada and the Aboriginal groups in Canada. And so the Inuit organized and started advocating for the land claim agreement to determine their own destiny. And in 1976, the first proposal for Nunavut was launched or given to Parliament to table, and there's two notable items in the proposal. One is a creation of the territory called Nunavut, and that Inuktitut be a working language. So there's this idea that Inuktitut would be the language that we speak in formulating policy, thinking about policy. The term I've heard used in Alaska is intellectual self-determination, that because your worldview is reflected in how you work, it'll be reflected in the decisions that are made. So this is very much present in the proposal for the land claim agreement in 1976. As we know, in 1982, the Constitution Act is proclaimed in Canada, and in the same year, there was a referendum for division in the NWT. And that was, again, relating to Nunavut, wanting to divide from the NWT. In 1983, there's a court case in Yukon on the question of whether French is an official language. As a result of that court case, in 1984, the federal government tried to unilaterally amend the NWT Act and the Yukon Act to entrench bilingualism of English and French. Ms. Metallic explained that in the Canadian Constitution, the provinces' powers are listed, the federal powers are listed, for territories, our powers are delegated through the Nunavut Act, NDBT Act, and the Yukon Act. So the federal government tried to say that the official languages were English and French. And this was trying to eliminate the uncertainty around bilingualism of English and French. And this had quite a political backlash from the NWT, where the Aboriginal groups said, what about our languages? And so after some discussions, an agreement was entered into between GNWT and the federal government that the federal government would fund French language services in perpetuity, so forever, as well as funding for preservation and promotion of Aboriginal languages. So just to state that there's a convention, a practice that started then of funding Aboriginal promotion and preservation of Aboriginal languages then. I'm going to skip through much of this. In 1999, the Nunavut Territory is created, and the question of the language had been left to them to legislate on. So in 2001, a committee is struck to start creating the language laws, and it took 7 years to pass them, and these acts outline how Nunavut wants equality between the languages, as well as the extra measures that Nunavut feels need to protect and revitalize the Inuit language. So the challenge we've seen so far is the federal government's role to redress the language situation and the decline and the continuing decline of the Inuit language. Between 1996 and 2006, there was a 12% drop in the use of the Inuit language in the home. And this continues to decline, the use as the mother tongue, the use and those able to converse. So the momentum of the assimilation policies of the past is still very strong, and it's very personal. I catch myself speaking English to my children. Colonialism is very internalized. The shaming and the embarrassment that Bonnie spoke about is very real, and I have to psych myself up to present in Inuktitut because I know I'll make mistakes, and it's part of that shame. So the predominance of English is very strong, and in my son's school, as an example, where it's a bilingual school and my son is in the Inuktitut stream, they speak English in the playground. And so there's an obvious need to focus extra energy on the Inuit language. So language has been central to Inuit of Nunavut negotiating their relationship with Canada through the land claim process. And the language has been in part of the negotiations right from the beginning. And it was decided that Inuit as a majority of the new territory would be able to legislate and identify how they want their language treated. Especially the continuing decline of our language and the historical attempts to eradicate it. We really need the negotiations between Nunavut and the federal government have not concluded. And until positive obligations are acknowledged by the federal government, given the history and the continuing inequality. And unfortunately, what happens is the hierarchy of official languages. The language situation with the Inuit being very challenged ends up leaving the Francophone community feeling like they should not assert their rights, recognizing the Inuit should really be given the attention. So the language situation then affects both vulnerable language groups in Nunavut. And so I'd just like to propose that the natural evolution of the language debate in Canada is to, I think, not only for us to expect that the Aboriginal language is part of the landscape, and that we need to start investing in Aboriginal languages. I'll finish here. Thank you.
Thanks very much. This was a very rich panel in many ways, but a lot of intersections also between our presentations by four women who are all practitioners in various ways in the promotion and preservation of Indigenous languages. Now I'll invite you to ask questions, make short comments maybe. We're running a bit late, so I'm going to be looking for direction from my bosses on my right here. But let's start with a question or comment.
Testing, are we live? We are. I'll make this brief. What many of you may not know is that political awareness resulting in the formation of political organizations in the Aboriginal community began in the early 70s, usually attributed to the tabling by the then federal government of the day of the so-called white paper, quickly answered, led by a coalition of chiefs from Alberta with the red paper, of course. That sparked a subsequent cultural revival, which has snowballed and continues to grow today. And now I get to the bragging part. Several weeks ago, I scored what I think must be a coup in federal government circles. I actually got my Director General and my Associate Deputy Minister out of the office for an entire day, and I took them to the res. And we looked at my community, which is 20 minutes from downtown Montreal, to enjoy a whole day to see what the community is doing in terms of language revitalization. And I think they were blown away. Now, Kahnawake is a very progressive community, very politically astute, and fairly well off by comparison to most other communities in the country. So what they saw was the Cadillac version. But the chief who took us around, who's very strong in her culture and language, in response to my question, estimated that about 80% of the community was in some way involved in reclaiming their language, which is incredible. I was really pleased to see in Marie-Odile's presentation that picture of her team. And correct me if I'm wrong, only two of the team members are men, right? In that photo? Right. And not for nothing is it called mother tongue transmission. Women are the holders of the language. I'm delighted to see the lineup, as you already mentioned, of today's afternoon panel. Something that I know that had I been in a position and been of the awareness that I am now to reclaim my own language, before we had the phraselator, before we have Rosetta Stone, we have interactive DVDs. Before DVDs, we had CDs. Before CDs, we had cassettes, which what I listened to on the old Sony Walkmans. Before that, we had Surlocks bound booklets produced by small organizations. Before that, we had the hand-cranked Gestetner photocopies that we all remember from our high school days. Remember the warmth and the smell. Right? So there's been tools, particularly for Kanien'kehá:ka, the Mohawk language. There's been tools. We've always got tools, and we have more tools than ever. We excel in producing tools. So something I've been percolating on is Tools are only as good as the people that pick them up to use them. If they're not picked up, then what? So remembering back to the days when I worked for First Nations and seeing the Assembly of First Nations Annual General Assembly in the 1990s, and looking down from the Sasktel place, which is a huge sports arena, and looking at those chiefs down there, all of them speaking English, thinking, what's wrong with this picture? Something that John Rayner has spoke to, and we'll talk, because I have something for you to answer the question you posed. He wrote an article about the need for the Maori in New Zealand and the New Zealand government to market the language and the culture to the Pakeha, the non-Maori, to the country at large, in order to gain that support, understanding, and acceptance, such that the two halves, the two solitudes, if you will, come together. So my open question to the panel, forgive me for the background, is to light the fuse such that the tools will be picked up. If we light the fuse, we won't be able to produce the tools fast enough. What are your thoughts on how do we light the fuse for the next generation, for the youth who will continue to carry the language? Thank you.
Anybody wants to answer this?
I will. So I guess gladly and proudly can say we've already lit the fuse in Tyendinaga, in that we have, for the past, I think, 7 or 8 years now, been, one of our programming is Language Nest, in that the babies go there to speak, learn to speak. So glad to say that in Tyendinaga, a few years back, we had our first mother tongue Mohawk speaker in that child, I would say in the last, as being the first person in the last maybe 80 years. And since then, we have generated more. And at the same time, that child's parents has been in adult education, adult immersion programming. So the language then moved outside of class time into the homes. So we now have language-speaking families in Tyendinaga, young people. These are newborn babies, so everything is being ignited. And as I say, is starting with the younger generation who are eager and able, more able, I would say, to start learning the language. And I think that is the emphasis that's needed, especially behind immersion programming is the most valuable. However, even if you get language awareness into the education system, I think that's why over the last 40, 50 years, Aboriginal people have been advocating to get our language into the education system. 67% of the Indigenous population lives in the urban areas now, of which they go to public education. So get our language into public education. And that's where I see the non-Aboriginal people being the allies in that can be sparked in the public education system, school boards, to get some kind of language and cultural programming going in your district. So everybody can contribute to that, not only the Indigenous people of advocating for it, but also to the non-Indigenous allies requesting it. Living in this country, I would think that it's most important that the next generation of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people understand each other on a better footing, in that they know their language and culture. So we'll have in 20 years a better population of people, social structure in Canada. That's igniting that fire in everybody of the idea that we can share that kind of thing. So I think it really starts with the young getting it to be okay, especially in our education system, because it's mandatory. So let's use it to our betterment.
I have a comment, but can I use that mic because I can't look up at the light? Is that still
Sure.
on?
We'll go to Sandra first. and
Okay,
then we
sorry,
can-
so I can't. Sorry.
In Nunavut, we have a lot of really neat projects happening. Our film in the Inuit language, creation of films is quite strong. There's starting to be, there's television shows, and TV Nunavut is also just starting to try and create a channel that's dedicated to the Inuit language. There's a publishing company that's creating books, children's books and music, and one of which, those of you going to the reception tonight, she's an author, musician, just an overall very talented artist, will be performing tonight. There's apps for tablets for kids and for adults, and there's more and more courses, immersion. I've been pushing for a full immersion program, and the pilot project is supposed to happen this summer. So there are things happening, and there's a momentum building in Nunavut, and this is so exciting to see where the young people who are starving to have any kind of an opportunity to learn the language are going to have the opportunity to do so.
Is that mic?
I don't know. I would hope that mic is still on.
I can't sit in front of the flashing light. So, I'm sorry, and I can't see you right now either as a result.
We're still here.
Yeah, I'm gonna sense, oh, there we go. To answer that, I agree with, with both of my colleagues, what you said, but as Bonnie was saying though too, that fire has been lit. Back in 1995, so not that long ago, but I was just placing the date, I was doing research on Manitoulin Island, but with one group of Indigenous students who had attended school mainstream and the other on alternative schooling, so or private reserve school. But with regard to the language specifically, and what I'd mentioned in my paper and what had been mentioned previously though too, is that the language has not been, you can't assume that the parents are teaching it to the children, because most often they're not, because of their intrinsic, what has become innate fear that if you've been tortured, not just abused, we're talking tortured for speaking, one word in your language, you're not going to speak it, and you're not going to leave your children susceptible to that. So this group of students who I was interviewing had such a passion to regain their language. What they had done for themselves by their own volition, their own ideas, their own motivation, is they had decided amongst them that they were going to develop their own immersion program. In school, outside of school, in the cafeteria, in the restaurants, at home, everywhere. They were only going to speak to each other in Ojibwe. But they didn't have all the words. So what they decided to do was, well, they'd go to their aunties and uncles or grandparents, whoever could tell them, who would speak to them and say, yeah, this is the correct word in Ojibwe. And often they wouldn't get an answer though. So they would decide amongst themselves, what's going to be the word? And that would be it. I was just in awe. I was like, you're kidding. So the same reaction though is then thinking, okay, from 95 to now we got 2015, and I'm not a linguist, but I am wondering how long it takes for a dialect to actually become an official dialect. But there will be one that comes out of Manitoulin because of this group of kids who have decided to regain their language and go with it and run with it. And speaking of picking up the toolkit, they've made their own toolkit. So there's another inspirational model for language that is just so exciting and so significant. So I'm going to stay over here.
Thank you. Marie-Odile, peut-être que tu pourrais nous parler un petit peu du tool.
Maybe you could talk us a little bit about the toolkit. We've been seeing images for a few minutes, but it would be interesting.
Aux 1000 mots, je me suis dit que plutôt que vous laissiez un...
So rather than have a white screen, this is the thematic images from the thematic dictionary from the James Bay. and all of the different categories within this dictionary are categories, are Cree categories. We did not start with the English or French language, but we did research based on the categorization, the categories for the Cree language. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the culture, and you need to hear the words, really. Any other questions?
Coming from a school division where we have about 30% Aboriginal students,
Il y a 30%.
Majority English speakers can support the school division to encourage third language learning for the Aboriginal languages.
Quelle langue?
Which language?
I'm assuming it's Ojibwe in my area, just
where are
outside
you?
Winnipeg.
Winnipeg?
Yeah.
Okay, so you'll have Cree and Ojibwe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one difficulty you're going to encounter is that there are lots of dialects. And unlike New Zealand, Maori doesn't have that much diversity. So often people cite the New Zealand model, but it's a whole different ballgame in Canada. I just work within one language family, and often you're going to just have to pick one or two and then try to do these ones, right?
I guess I have a question. In your school, is the Aboriginal language accredited course?
I don't think it is at this time. I doubt that Manitoba has it as accredited.
I would
could
doubt
be
that
wrong.
it is. So I would say that's some place to start, because the non-Aboriginal students and even the Aboriginal students aren't going to put time into it if they're not going to get a credit for it. So there has to be some kind of reward. And again, I would like to say that people, the non-Aboriginal people from the different walks of life in their jobs can support and advocate for this, creating this awareness in the young people that it's okay and you're going to get credit for it. They're getting credit for German, they're getting credit for Spanish, they're getting credit for Mongolian. Why not get credit for Cree or Ojibwe right in their own territory where they're going to use it, but also get credit for it? So if some place, and the thing is, if some place would start doing that, we can start saying, setting it up as precedent to say, Manitoba's doing it, how come Ontario's not doing it? So those are the kinds of things.
Rhonda?
Just quick, one thing I think that people in general, not just within the school system, but if you are wanting to implement like language courses or ways to support, I go back to the comments about the attitude. What is projected in, not just in your words, but in the way you conduct yourselves. And often I hear feedback from students that these Native Awareness Days are just the ugliest moments of their lives because everyone skips school or goes to school and makes fun of them going, oh, this is your day. Mm-hmm. So it's actually answering your question in a negative of to eliminate the things that separate, whether it's physical separation and segregation or in attitudes, and support people speaking the language to eliminate being made fun of, which people love to do with different languages, and they make fun of the sounds and mimic. And those kind of negativity, that kind of negativity can be eliminated, I think, through the attitudes, starting top down, with the teachers who won't permit it in the classrooms, with the principals who won't permit it amongst the teachers, and make it inclusive. Make it that this is not just for a certain group of students, make it for everyone. And even if it's not accredited, which would be the best solution over time, but to begin with, just make it something that everyone is doing together. So that's one suggestion.
Thank you. I've been advised that, okay.
One sub-project we have with this Algonquian Linguistic Atlas, which covers Cree and Ojibwe, is to maybe develop a number of online courses for language. So, because one of the biggest problems in offering Aboriginal languages at universities is to find instructors, qualified instructors, and also the lack of resources, the lack of material. So one idea, we haven't started on that, but I'd be curious, I'd be interested to hear about your needs and see if we could put together something, like an online course, or even maybe a 6 weeks, or something. Doesn't have to be university level yet, but we're exploring how to use the material we have with the Linguistic Atlas to maybe put something together so that several institutions could pool money together and make a quality course available online. So let me know about, contact me for that, okay?
Merci, Marie-Odile. Alors,
Thank you very much, Marie-Odile.
that unfortunately we're out of time. So I want to thank you all for participating in this, and I'm sure you'll join me in thanking our speakers for excellent presentations.